Hello, welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management. We'd like to thank Capital One, our sponsor for the podcast from OSCON in Austin, Texas. Learn more about Capital One's developer program at developer.capitalone.com. Hey, it's Alex Williams, the New Stack here at OSCON in Austin, Texas, and I'm here to talk about open source licensing with Jim Jagielski, a senior distinguished fellow at Capital One. Hey, Jim, how are you?
Hey, very good, Alex. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for letting me talk.
You were telling me just before we started that you were one of the original founders of the Apache Software Foundation.
Yes, that's right, I was.
And it started in 1999, and it really needed a legal entity because at that time, IBM wanted to use the Apache server for WebSphere.
That's right, that's correct. Yeah, at the time, we were just this nebulous group of volunteers that we called ourselves the Apache Group. And so, even though the Apache web server was under an open source license, the Apache license, there really wasn't a legal entity that IBM felt comfortable negotiating with to be able to actually embed that. They wanted to make sure that there was no legal difficulties in embedding this open source project into their commercial product, which of course obviously makes sense. So they were very, very beneficial in helping us go through the paperwork and legalities of getting the ASF, the Apache Software Foundation, incorporated.
So at OSCON, you discussed open source licensing 101.
That's right.
How do you view the roots of the Apache Software Foundation and how companies approach open source licensing in today's world?
Oh, that's a great question. One of the things that Apache at the very, very beginning of, and you can kind of see it with the relationship we had, with IBM at the time, is that we always wanted our software to be business friendly. We wanted to create an environment where people could use our software in basically any way whatsoever with as few restrictions as possible. So if they wanted to, bundle it inside a commercial proprietary product, that was okay. We wanted a license that would allow that. The other thing that we want to do is also create an ecosystem where people could create, other businesses around it. For example, sales, support, services, and things like that way. It's not only just the selling of software that's important, but also the support services associated with it. And of course, back then, the idea of using open source was incredibly scary because who do you call if there are problems? There wasn't really anyone at all, really providing that kind of support. But that created a cottage industry of companies that provided that sort of capability. I mean, Red Hat is a perfect example of that. That's really where their business model is providing sales and services around open source projects. So in a lot of ways, the mindset of Apache at the very, very beginning was to create an environment where companies like Red Hat and others would grow and thrive.
So today, what should open source licensing do for companies? What kind of an environment should it help create in today's world?
Yeah, that's there are different kind of business models associated with open source companies or companies that want to consume or leverage open source. And the nice thing is that there are different types of license models out there that allow them to define and refine their business strategy around it. For example, there are the strong copyleft licenses. These are licenses like the GPL v2 and v3, which really restrict the amount of restricted ways that you can go and embed that into proprietary code. It requires that this software remain always free and available to people. Even if you do bundle it in with something proprietary, that proprietary software would immediately be under the GPL or whatever license that is. Now, for a lot of companies, that's very, very beneficial because that allows them to have some level of control or command over that community. MySQL is a perfect example of it, and I know that other companies also in the database industry, I don't know why databases move towards that, but MySQL was able to have their database software under a strong copyleft license, a GPL, but they were also able to sell proprietary licenses as well. So they created a business model where they were able to offer the open source free software versions to people, but if people wanted a commercial license for it, they could provide that as well. More permissive licenses, such as the Apache license or the BSD or the MIT license, just have a different computer model, have a different business model associated with that. It's much more tuned towards support and services, add-ons, consulting, things of that nature. So it really depends on what kind of business model a company is looking forward to, and you can pick and choose which license makes the most sense in those kinds of environments.
So it depends really on that business model in many ways. Mm-hmm. So what is the philosophy that Capital One is adopting in terms of open source licensing?
Capital One has a pretty pragmatic approach to open source licensing. By default, we accept and eagerly consume and leverage software which is under permissive licenses. These are the Apache V2 license, the BSD license, the MIT licenses. You really don't need to get really in-depth formal approval to either contribute back to those software projects which are under those licenses, or to use or depend on these licenses. The middle tier, something called a weak copy left, can sometimes be accepted, sometimes not. It really depends on the use case. Mostly depends on whether this is something which is going out to our mobile customer base. If it's software that we're distributing, for example, then there needs to be more look, from a legal and security team aspect on whether software under that license is okay. And in general, we don't allow the strong copy left without a really good, solid business reason, and ensuring that by using software which is under a strong copy left, we're not giving away or would be required to give away information that we would want to keep private and safe and confidential.
Okay, so the open source culture at Capital One is relatively young.
Yes.
For a company in the industry, in the financial services sector, it's very forward-looking.
That's correct.
But it is young. So how do you envision Capital One's development as a technology organization in concert with open source licensing?
Mm-hmm. One of the great things that makes that easier is the very fact that our CEO, Rich Fairbanks, has sort of like made it a mandate that we are transitioning to a tech company, that we will be embracing all aspects of tech that allow us to do that, to make that transition, including a firm embracement of open source. So the very fact that we have that sort of mandate from the top, and we have a incredibly rich pool of people who are experts and knowledgeable in open source at the grassroots and middleware level, allow us to come up with a really good, cohesive open source strategy, which includes coming up with the list of acceptable licenses that we are allowed. Too many companies, when they go into this, really don't take, at least in my opinion, too much time and effort into looking at the impacts of licensing, or they have this sort of like knee-jerk reaction that GPL is always, verboten. You can never use GPL, which I don't think is long-term strategically wise. There are times and places where you need to use, software that may be under that license, especially if you're just using it for build services or content delivery in-house and things like that. So we have the mandate.
What is the bias against GPL then?
I guess the bias between GPL is people are scared of it. The analogy that I give is I kind of like compare code to cookies. In fact, that was the basis of my talk yesterday at Intersource Licensing in 101. And I took the 3 basic types of licenses and said, okay, imagine that code was cookies, and so the source code were the recipes behind the cookie, and the actual program was the cookie itself. And in this case, I used an Oreo. Now with the BSD or permissive licenses, if Nabisco were to use an open source cookie recipe for the black cookie part and made modifications to it or changes to it to help it be better manufactured or something like that, they would still be able to keep those changes proprietary. There would be no requirement for them to give those fixes back. Now, as you go towards a more strong copyleft license like GPL, what that would require is, because they're modifying that cookie recipe, they would be required to send not only those fixes back, but also the special recipe for the creamy double stuffed filling in the middle.
Right.
So a lot of people use the term viral in nature, which I don't like, because it's sort of like, ouch, you sneezed on me, I got GPL on me, get it off, get it off. So I don't like that term. The unfortunate part about it is that when you say it's a viral license, people immediately understand what it means. It's just that if your software is dependent on a piece of GPL code, then that means all that software has to be under GPL code, which means it's required to be public and under basically be free software, open source, if you redistribute it.
Right. So there's that bias towards it then. What is in your view the most widely accepted licensing that companies are most comfortable with?
Definitely, I think the Apache V2 license, not only because it's a permissive license, which means companies have very, very few restrictions on what they can do with it, but also it has an explicit patent clause inside of it. Most other permissive licenses, like the BSD and MIT licenses, companies like them as well, but how does it handle patents? What are the conditions that, there is a school of thought that there is an implied patent grant or a patent license associated with that, but that's the kind of thing that gets some lawyers and legal teams kind of scared. What that means, actually having an explicit patent clause inside the Apache V2 license means that businesses just naturally gravitate towards it. So you're seeing a lot of businesses really embracing that license.
What do you see as some of the gaps in licensing that will need to be filled as more technologies get developed for distributed environments and for the edge, in particular, where we may start seeing, more devices connected maybe to a main data center, but maybe even to like an edge, compute environment.
Sure, that is the biggest. I think right now in the open source community, that is the biggest question. Is because before, the way you used and leveraged open source was that you were distributing software. But now you're not distributing software. It's software as a service. It's infrastructure as a service. It's platform as a service. So the license of the software running that really doesn't affect people, because they're never distributing the software out there. And that's one of the reasons why the Free Software Foundation created a special version of GPL called the AGPL, the Athero GPL, specifically designed to handle those cases. And basically it says that redistribution of software, which is when these licenses kick in, even applies if you're just using the software as a service. So even if you're not distributing the software to an end user, but they are using the software on another server, then the license needs to kick in. That is, as far as I know, the only software license that does that, but it certainly is with the move to the cloud, with the move to a lot of these services being software that people don't run themselves. It's not distributed in nature. The services themselves are distributed, but the software that's driving those services is not distributed. That is what's really causing a question mark about, what is open source now? What is open source licensing? Where are there touch points with people who are using and leveraging that software?
Interesting. So we have these, these new requirements, that we need to, take into consideration. Software as a service and
Right.
Cloud services such as AWS and are emerging, right?
That's right. Yes.
As you all know, you guys are using the AWS platform.
Mm-hmm.
What is the direction then for Capital One in terms of what are the kind of the progresses you're looking that you're going to be watching, as you starting using more distributed platforms yourself?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that we still have to worry ourselves internally because certainly one of the differentiating factors of Capital One is our expertise in the mobile market. I think that the people, not to, well, yes, to applaud Capital One because it's fantastic work, but our mobile apps are really, really well known, well designed. I mean, really, really super functional, and of course, that's something that you download. So we still have to worry about, software licenses, because we do still distribute software in a mobile market. And that is still something that I think people will always need to worry about because you're always going to be downloading apps and things like that.
Right.
As far as how that impacts our cloud structure, I think we've got to really determine how that is. I mean, certainly we see the cloud as something which is reimagining and redesigning how infrastructure is designed, how software itself is implemented and delivered. And I don't think we have a clear idea yet. I don't think anybody really has a clear idea yet about what all these license characteristics are associated with them. We are at this transition point. The nice thing about it is that Capital One is really moving in a direction where some of the questions that other tech companies may not be asking themselves because they're not, worried about it, because they're not in the financial industry space. They don't have federal regulations to worry about. We are directly addressing this question. So I think Capital One is in a sweet spot to be able to answer a lot of these questions.
Those questions such as what that Capital One may be more cognizant of than
things such as the touch points, the interfaces between open source licensing and software, distributed services, and how to best contribute back to distributed services as well. You always want some level of control on any piece of software, any piece of infrastructure that your company is pretty dependent upon. So how do you make sure that you're able to contribute to it, back to it? Because that's really what open source is about, is be able to contributing back to software that is very, very important to you. I mean, that's certainly what got me first involved with Apache in the first place, is I was running a small ISP using Apache web server, as part of that. And so it was, part of my business. So I contributed back so I could, continue it on. All businesses are in that way. So to really take full advantage of open source, and be aware of what open source licensing is about, you have to have a really good contribution process. And that is also where licenses kick in, because you want to make sure that you're contributing back under the same licenses and contributing back to software that has the license that you would prefer.
I think in just some finale, I'd like to kind of go back to the overall market and the future of the Apache Software Foundation. Mm-hmm. There's interesting subtle differences between the Apache Software Foundation and other organizations.
There is. There's quite a bit. First of all, the ASF is a 501c3, in the IRS code, and that's basically a public charity.
Right.
So everything we do is for the public good. The other thing is that
which is different than the Linux Foundation.
Right, which is a trade group, a 501c6.
Yeah.
Some people disparagingly call it a pay-to-play environment. I don't like that term, but it really is a way for companies to have more direct control over the direction of an open source project. The ASF is pretty much all volunteer-based. We have an extremely lean budget. And our philosophy is community over code, such that the communities themselves drive the future direction of the software project. Companies don't have a say. Companies can't become a member. Companies are sponsors, and we love our sponsors, but even being a sponsor doesn't give them any more undue influence over the direction of the code. We really think that at the ASF, it's all about the individual contributor. That's where the power, the energy, the enthusiasm, and the innovation behind open source comes from. And so we created a foundation to really focus on the individual contributor. And the nice thing about that is that it creates this extremely neutral playground for other companies to collaborate together, rather than one which your voice may be dependent on how much money you've paid towards the foundation.
Interesting. Well, Jim, thank you so much for taking some time to talk with me. It's a real honor to get to speak to someone who was really there in the earliest days of open source community and open source licensing.
I've earned every gray beard, every gray hair.
Yeah. Yeah, well.
Okay.
So nice to chat with you, and look forward to keeping in touch.
Hey, definitely, yeah. It's been my pleasure, really.
Thank you.
Love it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We'd like to thank Capital One, our sponsor for the podcast from OSCON in Austin, Texas. Learn more about Capital One's developer program at developer.capitalone.com. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Bakers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.